I think the hour has struck. That was my hour striking in the background. And
oh, yes, it has.
I'm going to do a quick intro, and then I'm going to turn it over for the rest of the hour to Anna. So welcome everybody to this experiment in our virtual Waterbirds conference. The organizing committee really wanted to try a bunch of new experiments this time around since we were going to be online. And it just seemed like it'd be an ideal opportunity to branch out and try and engage with the art world as well as with the scientific world. And so I was asked, did I have any folks who mixed it up between birds and art? And I said, boy, do I. And so tonight and tomorrow night, you're going to get to work with two of them. Tonight's instructor is Anna Stunkel, and Anna graduated from College of the Atlantic several years ago. She was an enthusiastic bird person the whole way through. She worked out on Great Duck Island in the first autumn season that we had, working in collaboration with some of the University of Maine people on songbirds. She also worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on Petit Manan in the Tern Restoration Project. She's done extensive work doing hawk watches, both on this coast and on the West Coast. And her senior thesis, everybody at College of the Atlantic has to do a senior thesis that is sort of a capstone to their 4 years of courses. Hers was a self-illustrated guide to the birds of Mount Desert Island, and it's simply spectacular. And I believe if you want to check it out, it's on Anna's webpage. So when I was talking with the organizing committee about getting somebody who could come in and do some work with us on art, Anna was immediately on my mind. And without further ado, Anna Stunkel, take it away.
Thanks, John, and thanks to the Waterbird Society for having this event. I'm really, really excited. So we're going to get right to it because I know when I do these art classes, I tend to start to go overtime and we only have an hour. So I'm going to be setting up my phone on a tripod. And if you get out some paper, pencils, colored pencils, ideally, if you have them. And if you're able to pull up the reference photo from the event description of the Common Eider, it would be great if you could have that on hand, you know, as a printout or on a second device while we're following along. Otherwise, you can just follow while I'm drawing. So let me switch my screen around. So this is who we're going to be drawing today. And I got this particular photo off of a web source called Pixabay. I also do a fair bit of bird photography, but it's a really great resource because there are a lot of free photos there that artists can use as references. Just so you're aware, that's pixabay.com. So as far as supplies that I would recommend, I just want to go over a few of those before we get started. So the paper that I'm using here is called Strathmore bristle paper, and it's smooth bristle paper. I personally like to use really smooth paper because you don't get, you know, the tooth when you're drawing in colored pencil where you have kind of more white spots. But this is really nice smooth paper. It's 9 by 12. And then just a regular number 2 pencil is what I use to begin my outline. You can use, you know, there's some drawing pencils like Derwent drawing pencils are nice if you would like, because there's different softnesses of those. And then I have some colored pencils here. My favorite brand, if I was to pick just one brand, is Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. But another brand that's really, really nice is Prismacolor colored pencils. Polychromos are my favorite because they maintain a point really well. So like when you sharpen them, they're not going to break as easily, and they have really vibrant colors and a good range of colors. And in particular, they have a good range of like browns and grays, which is important for drawing birds a lot of the time. Another thing that I like to use is this electric eraser. This is a Sakura electric eraser, and it has these little replaceable erasers that you put in there. You can get like a set with, I think, 75 in a pack. And it is battery powered. So there's a button here that you press, and it works really, really well for erasing colored pencil. So, you know, when you have some of your darker colors, or if you have several layers on, it can be hard to erase with just a regular eraser. So that just helps. I do a lot of sharpening. This particular sharpener is my favorite one. It just works really well. It's the Faber-Castell Polychromos. And personally, I prefer this kind of just handheld sharpener. The battery-powered or electric ones, they kind of like make your pencils wear down a little faster, in my opinion. So let's see, what else? I like to have just a little soft brush for brushing off eraser crumbs. That way you're not trying to use your hand and getting like a lot of oils from your hand and smudging. And sometimes I'll use Q-tips for blending. That's more like for this particular drawing, if I was doing the water, I might use a Q-tip for blending or a paper stump. So those are the basic tools. I wanted to show you also, so for drawing birds, it's nice to have some reference books on hand. This is a really good one for waterfowl. And yeah, some examples, because you can take a look at, you know, different poses and angles and things like that. This book is actually designed for artists and decoy artists and things like that. It's pretty old. I think it might be out of print, but I think you may be able to get it used online in some places. Waterfowl Studies by Bruce Burke. But there are plenty of other books out there, and you know, there's no substitute for getting out there and really observing birds out in the field. So I'd really recommend, you know, trying some focused studies like the one we're doing today, but also getting out there and doing field sketching, taking a field journal out. And water birds can sometimes be among the most cooperative birds for field sketching, because, you know, sometimes you'll see ducks that are sitting very still, or shorebirds that are hanging out, maybe even sleeping and not moving around much. So that provides a good opportunity for study. And I would definitely start, you know, if you want to go out and field sketch, with things that don't move as much, just because it'll make it easier on you. But of course, I'm sure a lot of the people watching today are scientists or researchers. So art is, of course, a wonderful way to improve your observation skills. And the more you can vary your subjects and your methods of drawing, the mediums you use, and things like that, the more you'll learn. So I may pull out this picture occasionally, but for the most part, we're just going to be working on paper here, and you can follow along. As far as colors that we're going to be using some yellows for the bill. So you'll want to pull out some of those. And then we probably won't be using very much brown today, but definitely light grays and some white pencils. You know, we're not going to be actually using white to put down white pigment, but I do like to use a white pencil for blending, which we'll talk about more later. And then dark indigo will be good for some of these darker areas, and like dark browns and blacks are good colors to have on hand. There's a tinge of green in here too, kind of like an earthy colored green, olive green, yellowish, or something like that would be good. So I will name colors as we use them. but you may not have a color with that exact name that I described, but just something close is totally fine. However, before we get to the colors, we're going to draw the outline. And please do let me know throughout if you have a question that comes to mind as you're going along. You can either say it out loud or put it in the chat box. Because I'm on my phone, it would be great, John, if you could keep an eye on the chat box, because sometimes they don't pop up right away. But what we're going to start out with is just drawing a line to show like the base of where the eider is in the water. And you want to go nice and big, because that will help you to really add the most details that you possibly can. And think about, you know, what proportions this eider show that will fit onto the paper. So I actually am measuring. The way that I measure is to take my pencil and I'll say, okay, for example, let's say I wanted to measure the length here from the tip of the bill to the back of the head. I would say, okay, here's the tip of my pencil here, and then take my fingernail on my thumb there and measure. That's the size of the head that I want. But it's also a good idea to practice eyeballing it, because that will help you when you're out in the field sketching. So let's see. We're just going to draw this line here. It can have a little bit of curvature to it, but this isn't going to be exact. It's just a guideline for where we're going to start. So that's where the bird is sitting in the water there. And then, so now we're going to draw a shape for the body. Basically like this, curved at the top here. And then kind of comes around like this, down a little bit. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see that pretty well. I'm actually going to move it down a little bit so it's zoomed in more. There we go. Yeah, so try and make sure to keep it nice and big. And then the tail kind of comes to a point there. We're not going to add the tail feathers yet. This is just a basic geometric shape for the body here. And then, of course, we want to draw sort of the bigger shapes first before we move on to smaller details. So I'm going to draw the neck and the head next. And I'm going to do my measurements first just to make it faster, but I would recommend trying to draw very, very lightly with your pencil the shapes and then measuring second and making adjustments, because that will help you to learn how to eyeball things a little bit. And the common eider, you know, they have a really interesting head shape. It's kind of triangular. Or almost like a trapezoid. We've got like this line that comes down here. And then like this down to the bill. So I'm just sketching in the very basic shape here, and then we can make adjustments later. Another thing you can do to check yourself is say, okay, I want to make sure I got the proportions about right. And if you didn't measure everything, but you're just eyeballing, you can say, okay, how many heads long is the body? About? All right, so I drew 1. It's a little more than 2. I think I made my head a little bit small, and then you can compare it to the photo and see. Yeah. So I can check my measurements again on this photo. I'm trying to make it as big as I can so people can see. And then you can also start paying attention to, the angles. There's kind of a point here where the angle changes in the neck. And the other thing to pay attention to is negative spaces. So the negative space is the space, for example, in here. So you can measure, okay, how far is the tip of the bell from the front of the chest here? So it's an interesting exercise to pay attention to that also. To look at a picture and say, okay, I'm not going to look at the shape of the bird itself, but instead I'm going to try and draw the shape of what isn't there, basically. So that can sort of train your brain to look at things from a new perspective also. All right. So in this particular bird, you're really not seeing very much of the wing. So we're not going to get hugely into, all the feather structure of the entire wing, because you have plumes that come over the top of the wing here. And then you also have belly plumes coming up from the sides that are covering quite a bit of the wing. So all we really see are the primaries, which are sticking out the end and crisscrossing over the back like that. So that is going to make things a little bit easier for us, but I definitely recommend, looking at pictures of birds where you can see more of the wing there. But with ducks, this is often the case. They have a lot of very loose, fluffy feathers and plumes and things like that covering up the wings. So to show that, we're just going to sketch in basically the borders of some of these markings. We've got this really big black patch on the side here. So, as you're drawing a bird like this, it's going to really help to cement those field marks into your memory, as well as the general proportions and shape of the bird. So it's a really good way to get to know that bird better. So this is like the undertail coverts here. I'm blocking that in. And now I'm going to draw the tail feathers. So with ducks, a lot of times they kind of stick their tail feathers up, especially ruddy ducks. But the position may be different depending on what the bird is doing. So here we can see it's kind of like this half of the tail here, but then it comes around. Like that, and then you can see this other side of it. Okay. And one thing to be aware of too is, this is more for later on and maybe when you're drawing birds where you can see the flight feathers, the tail feathers, and the wing feathers a little bit better. But try to be aware of the number of feathers that are in, various flight feather groups. So most birds are going to have 12 rectrices, 12 tail feathers, 6 on each side. And they usually have 10 primaries and between like 12 and 16 secondaries a lot of the time. So it is good to be accurate and pay attention to those things. But yeah, okay, now let's move on to the wings. We have, you can kind of see the other side of the bird too. There's this sort of dividing line here. We can get into a little bit more detailed shape, I guess. We have this wing coming around here, and then you can see the other wing there. And you can use sort of sketchy lines to show where the plumes come over the back and cover up a lot of that wing there. Then here we have the primaries, which curve like that and then sort of start to disappear behind the tail. It's really just a thin sliver kind of there. I know I'm drawing maybe a little darker than I might otherwise do, but I would recommend keep your lines fairly light. So if you need to make adjustments, it's easy to do so. And then we have these other primaries. Let me just show you here again, that are coming underneath the left wing, crisscrossing. So we just have a little triangle to show those. Okay. And let's see what we have left. We're going to add some more detail to the head. So outlining the bill. Eiders have this really long sloping bill here. Very interesting shape. And then you have a triangle. Comes in like that. And the mouth line basically there. You can also add in the nostril here. So try and look at the position of that. I need to move mine down a little bit. And then also notice they have this little bump at the end of the bill here. That's curved like that. And then, you can look at the head and say, okay, I might need to make some adjustments to the shape there. Can look at the length of this kind of flattened area at the top of the head. Getting head shape can be really tricky because sometimes the smallest adjustments can actually make a big difference in how the bird ends up looking. Shape is definitely the most important part of your drawing because you can have all the details you want, but if the proportions and the shape and things look off, that can kind of throw things off a little. Oh, and then we have kind of this little sliver of feathers that comes down here, and you can sort of see the other side of the bill, just barely. So to help you position the eye, sometimes it can help to draw a line if you notice that it's in line with a certain point. So it's really just slightly above this point here is the top of the eye. And then you can also measure, if you want, how far away the front of the eye is from the bill here, and how far down it is from the top of the head. So eye position can be a tricky one because you don't want to get it too high or too low, or the expression of the bird will look a little bit off. And then the shape of it is kind of this little teardrop or seed shape almost, it looks like. So you can also measure the length of it and the width of it too. And then, you know, it's good to get major markings sketched in early on. So I'm also gonna add this black cap. It comes just below the eye and then across like that. And, you know, if you have a guideline here, you can erase that. Always good with your eraser, by the way, to check and make sure you don't have a dirty eraser because you don't want to accidentally smudge your picture. And then we have this sort of greenish marking on the back of the male eider's neck here that comes down, and then it's got this sort of rounded part. And then a line like that. So you can just lightly sketch that in. You might also want to add in this little line here, which is basically where the edge of the auriculars, the cheek feathers, it's right there. Yeah, so that's basics. Make the neck a little thinner, I think. Awesome. This is an interesting photo too because there's a bit of an angle. So, you know, like I said, it's fun to try out different angles and birds in flight, and you know, it's even fun. I'd recommend trying to draw ducks as they're diving. Which is going to be tricky in the field, you know, unless you have some kind of underwater field journal, but you can certainly look at photos and reference them. All right, so let's start to add color now. And I do want to show you, you know, tips and techniques for the whole bird, but we may not fill in the entire bird because it's already 8:28. But I want to make sure that I, you know, concentrate on each area so you can use these skills later on and maybe, you know, finish your drawing later on, but also be able to apply those skills to drawings later too. So we'll start with the eye. Let me make sure this is zooming in properly. I'm going to try and, there we go. I'll click my screen. All right. So if you're using colored pencils, whenever you're starting a new area of your drawing, you should erase the graphite until there's just a very, you know, kind of ghost of an outline remaining. So that way the graphite doesn't show through your drawing. If you're just using a pencil like this, you don't have to worry about that. So yeah, if you're just using a pencil like this, basically when I am using more pressure with a colored pencil or using darker colors in an area with multiple colors, then you're just going to use more pressure with your pencil. If you're using colored pencils, what I would recommend for the eye would be a very dark brown, like a dark sepia, or if you're using Prismacolors, it might be called dark umber. Dark sepia is pretty neutral. It's kind of like a grayish brown. So you're just going to outline the eye using the dark sepia and sharp. It's not a very big area we're working with here. And then we're going to shade in the whole base layer here, just very lightly. Except for, we're going to leave isolated the highlight at the back of the eye. So I'll just show you again in case you don't have the photo out. There's this highlight here. And you want to try when an eye has a highlight like that to keep it isolated in the area that's really, really bright. Because you want that to look really bright. That'll make the bird look more alive, you know. So I like to start with light pressure, leave a bit there. And, you know, some of it is gray, aside from the white spot in the middle, kind of. So you can use a medium cold gray, like this. Oh, I should mention something about the grays also. So it's going to be easiest if I just show you here. There are cold grays and there are warm grays. The cold grays are more like bluish gray. And in these particular brands, they're numbered. So they're numbered 1 to 6, with 1 being really light and 6 being pretty dark. So cold grays are more bluish, and then warm grays are kind of brownish or yellowish. And a mixture of the two is often really helpful to add depth to your drawing. But right now we're just going to use like a cold gray 3. Add a little gray in here, but leave that bright white spot. Zoom is trying to focus on my hand. It likes to do that. So then, now that we have that layer done, I can help to just add a little bit of warmth, use something like copper beech or a bit of a warmer brown and mix it with that dark sepia. Because even though in the photo the eye looks super dark, you know, photos often don't show all the details that are present in the eye. And you can go over the top of it and darken it up a little bit more with dark sepia. And, you know, in the photo, you can't see that there's a pupil there, but we're going to put the pupil in. And for that, you may have heard, you know, colored pencil artists, they will mix oftentimes dark indigo with a dark brown, like a dark sepia. That will give you black, actually. And it'll give you like a really nice, rich black color here, rather than just the black on its own will look kind of flat. Although you can go over the top of it with a black pencil just to darken it up a little. And I'm sorry I'm not zooming in more. I just know that if I do, it's going to try and look a little bit too blurry, and I don't want that. You can go around the edge with the black too. But hopefully you're getting the techniques that I'm talking about, even though it's kind of tiny. So now let's work on the bill. And for that, I have a few different shades of yellow here. So, you know, some of your lighter yellows for a base, and then some of the more brownish ochre colored yellows. It's also helpful, you know, if you have some orange, like cadmium orange, we're gonna add a hint of orange too. But, you know, usually when I'm doing a base layer, almost always, I should say, I go from light to dark. There are certain surfaces like pastel matte where you can actually go over dark colors with light, which is pretty cool, but can't really do that on just regular paper. So again, I'm erasing the outline of the bell so you can just barely see the graphite there. But it's still there to guide you, especially with something like yellow, like a yellow bell. You want to make sure you don't have too much of that remaining though. And I'm going to use for the base layer cadmium yellow. So it's kind of like a medium yellow. And just shade in that entire bill with the cadmium yellow. Yeah, when you get to here, the end, use just very light pressure at the tip of the bell. It's a little bit lighter. So then we can start going over the top of that with our darker colors. And there's definitely like brownish kind of ochre tones here, like this light yellow ochre. That's very close to the color that we have here. And then as far as the orange, you know, you can see a hint of orange at the front of the bell there. So I'm just going to take this light yellow ochre and shade in some of the darker areas. Another fun thing that you can do if you have an electric eraser is get the highlights in there. Or you can use a regular eraser, but like for example, this highlight right here, some of these little dots of highlights, or a whiteout pen. You have to be kind of careful with that to make sure it doesn't, you know, go all over the place, but you can test it on another piece of paper. And you can use whiteout pens for the little dot in the eye too. Yeah, so that color works really nicely for some of the darker areas here. Gonna add it to the nostril too, which we're gonna include some more dark colors in there later. So you can vary your pressure a little bit, you know, as you get to some of the darker areas, like right here, you can use a little bit more pressure. But with colored pencil, you know, I kind of test it out by starting with light pressure and then going darker as you feel comfortable. You know, it's darker along here where the mouth line is. I hope that's coming in clearly. If it's getting blurry or looks unclear, just let me know. I'm going to use a little cadmium orange right here. Top of the bell. And if you want to blend these colors a little bit, you know, for smoothing it out and blending them a little, you can go over the top with a lighter yellow. With the Polychromos, they have some glaze colors. Light yellow glaze is a good one for that. There are certain colors that just tend to work better for smoothing it out. And by smoothing, I mean, you know, trying to get rid of the white spaces in your paper. Yeah. To darken it up a little, you can add just a hint of gray in some of the darker areas to make sure you're showing contrast. Like along here. And then for the nostril, it's pretty dark in some spots. So if you get it pretty sharp, your pencil, you can just add in some of those darker lines here. All right. And then you can use the gray. I would use a fairly dark gray, like coal gray 5. And just make sure you get in this line between the mandibles here. It kind of goes up like that. And then along here. So there's kind of a little indent. And then it just goes up like that. Kind of a dark line along here as well. And this line. Okay. 8:41 already. All right. So now let's work on the cap area a little bit. I'm gonna erase some of this graphite, and we're just gonna do kind of one area of this. Maybe a couple of areas. We'll outline it first using.
Anna, we're losing your voice.
Uh-oh. Can you hear it now?
It's scratchy.
Let me try something. How about now?
That's better.
Yeah, so, thanks. Sometimes that happens. I don't know why. And I just have to mute and then unmute. I don't know why. Let me know if it happens again. So I'm going to just very lightly outline that cap using the dark indigo. Or any dark blue that you might have will work. And then when you get to this area, you know, it's sort of a fuzzy line. So you can make it a little bit textured. Also along here. So that's the texture of those little tiny feathers on the face. But the feathers are so small on an eider's face. So I'm just doing very textury lines. Oh, it's really like drawing fur at this point. And then you can outline along here too. Edge of the bill. And then, you know, if I was to do this entire cap, I would just shade this whole thing very, very lightly with dark indigo. But we're just going to do a section. And we're going to do the same thing of mixing dark indigo with a brown. And it will create black. So in the Faber-Castell Polychromos, walnut brown is really good for that. Any kind of sort of neutral, like medium brown, basically will work well. I'm just going to go over the top, again, pretty lightly. So what I like to do is, I'll do that and then I'll go over the top of it with black. Just because these layers underneath is what's going to add depth. And I'm going in the direction of the feathers. So, like this. I would not want to be shading this way because that's not the direction that the feathers are going. Even in your base layers, you want to try and maintain that direction. Because, that will show through even in the layers beyond that. So yeah, colored pencil is very much about layering. And, if you're out in the field sketching, maybe you wouldn't do a whole bunch of layers. But when you're doing a study like this, like when I'm doing a studio drawing, I will use tons and tons of layers. So now I'm just taking the black, going over the top. Some colored pencil artists I've heard will even use like 40 layers sometimes. This particular paper will not take that many, but sometimes I'll do like 5. Other surfaces like pastel matte, you can get more layers and that will create a lot of depth. So around the eye, you can leave a little area that's light. And this is where, you might want to take an electric eraser too. And just emphasize some of the highlights here. Like that. It takes practice because, of course, you might accidentally erase something that you didn't want to, which is fine. You just have to go back in and fix it. But then that'll up your contrast here. Because you've got light hitting around the edge of the eye there, there's this kind of eye ring. It's very, very thin. But yeah, we're just gonna go to there for now because I want to make sure we get to other areas too. But yeah, basically what I wanted to demonstrate there is you want to do more and more layers and you'll get some depth there. You can add a little more blue in some areas, especially the back of the head here. So you can see it's like a little iridescence going on there. You might even want to use a brighter blue, even something like this, phthalo blue, just with a tiny bit of pressure. So when there's iridescence on a bird, to show that and make it really look shiny, you want a lot of contrast. So contrast between that blue and the black. Same goes for anything that's iridescent, like a shiny beetle or anything like that. So let's talk a little bit about this area too. I would use colors like olive green. This is olive green yellowish. And then like a really light yellow. Maybe not a really light, yeah. Like a cream. This is cream here. And then just a little bit of gray, like a medium gray, cold gray, 3 maybe. Those can be mixed together to get some of the colors that you want here. So I'll just do a little section to demonstrate that. So again, you want to start light, like with the cream here, and go over the top with some of your darker cold gray, 3. And you can start getting some of this texture in here, the edge of the cheek feathers, which is why it's nice, with colored pencils, you can get a lot of these textured details. Works really well for feathers and for fur. Yeah, and this green colors works nicely here. Just do these little lines and light pressure. Nice to have your pencil be really sharp. And then for some of those shadows that are like in between feathers, you can see there's some deeper shadows. You'll want to use a bit of a darker gray, like for those lines there. So like a cold gray 6, and you can get it pretty sharp. Yeah, and don't be afraid, when there's areas that are dark, don't be afraid to make sure you get that contrast in there. It's tricky, because I definitely have a tendency sometimes to go too light, but that contrast is what'll add depth to your drawing. So then let's also talk about some of the lighter areas and what I would do for that. A good color for the sides of the face and the neck, you have to look very closely to see this, but there's actually like a tinge of pink here. So this is cinnamon, which is like a pinkish brown almost. I really like this pencil. It's a nice one to use. But if you have a light pink, that'll work too. And it's interesting because I'm looking at this picture on my computer screen versus the printout, and the color is a little bit different. So, depending on what you're looking at, you may see some different colors going on. But you can very lightly add that in. And then you can mix that with like a light gray. And I realize, this is probably not showing up that well on Zoom, and I'm sorry about that, but at least you can see the technique. Because if I go too dark, it's just gonna look funny. So then you can mix those together and smooth it out with a white pencil. A really, really good pencil for smoothing out colored pencils is this Luminance white. It's kind of a chalky colored pencil. And again, going in the direction of the feathers. And think about the direction that the light is coming from. So you've got quite a bit of light on the sides of the face here. It's really kind of coming from the side, and it's hitting the neck there pretty brightly. So that's going to be a bright area with a lot of contrast between that white and the shadows. So thinking about that, it can be good in some areas to make sure you get your shadows in first. So like this would be one spot is right under here. You want to get that shadow in. Because if you get it in there early, basically it's a way to make sure you don't forget about it and you make sure to have your dark spots in there. So you can use something like cold gray 6 for that really dark gray. And then lighten it here. You have kind of a distinct line here, but you don't want to outline that because it'll look like too much of a hard line. Instead, you just want to softly shade up to that edge there. And then along here, you have some nice texture too, like on the throat and the front of the neck. And again, I'd use like a cold gray, maybe 4 or 3, to show that texture here. All right. I'm not sure if we need to end right at 9. Do we, John? Probably, right?
Pretty close. It's a late night here, but
I thought so. But yeah, that's why I wanted to do
okay.
this section method. I do these classes on Facebook Live and I say they're going to be an hour and they always end up being like an hour and a half. So let's work on the back a little bit and then I'll also talk about the sides and the tail feathers just briefly. So you want to emphasize this contrast here where you have a shadow and then this bright area. So you have this line that curves around here. And then you have some feathers where you can see, you know, they're getting larger on the back, these feathers, and they have a pointed kind of shape, but they're still pretty loose feathers. Getting into, you know, some of the coverts here. So you can use a medium gray pencil and just start to sketch in where a few of those are. And then, you know, once you have their borders in, you can work on more of the midtones. And think about, you know, how these feathers are going to grow on a bird. They're going to be in rows, really. But they're of a size now where you can see them and they don't just look like tiny hairs almost once you get to this area on the wing. But you start to get, as you come down here, they get longer because you have some plumes here. So you can start to change the shape gradually of some of these feathers. They get very wispy. And, you know, as you start shading, you're going to have more gray along the shoulder here. And then it starts to get lighter. You can use the cream a little bit too, because you have just a tinge of that. You know, with birds that are white, almost never is there going to be just completely white with no shadow or color. There's like a spot here that's almost that way, but there's usually going to be at least some texture. And even that, it's probably just because it's a photograph, you know, that it looks that bright. If it was real life, you'd see more texture. Okay. 8:59. So I'm just going to say one more thing. You know, the side here is going to be pretty similar to working on this cap. You just have longer feathers again. So your strokes, your pencil strokes are going to be longer. And you want to look at the direction that the feather barbs are going. So they're very loose, kind of going up like this. But I just want to talk about the primaries here. So they're stacked. And you can use like a black pencil with light pressure and start to put those in. When you get to these ones here, you'll notice that there is this point, so they're very triangular as they come down like that. So the tail, similar thing going on. You have these long rectrices, these long tail feathers coming out here like this. And then there's kind of a fork where, you know, that there's half of the tail here and then you get around to the other half. So this top half, of course, there's some nice lighting here where you have sort of gray and blue that you can put in, and then you're going to have more shadow underneath here. Oh goodness, I went off the page. I'm sorry. My tripod started to move, but now you can see. So there's blue along here, and then you have shadow there. Okay. So those are some of the basics of drawing this little eider here. Because I'm zoomed in, that's the problem. So yeah, does anyone have questions?
Anna, that was awesome. Oh my goodness, I'm seeing some pictures popping up. Do you think you'll be oh, yay. Well done, Liz.
Yeah, I would love to see people's pictures. Oh, let me see if I can get out of this like presenting mode I'm in here.
Hey.
Glad you liked it. Oh, if you wanted to hold up your pictures, can I see again? Because I missed it.
Anna, do you think you could give us some links in the chat to your page and also to some of the sources and materials that you just listed?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So let's see. Chat.